The air above Simpson Harbor trembles in the pre-dawn humidity, thick with the smell of volcanic soil and aviation fuel. A young Japanese Navy pilot, named Warrant Officer Takeo Tanimizu, stands beside his Mitsubishi A610, running his gloved hand along the graceful curve of its wing. The metal is still cool from the night, smooth as folded silk. Around him, mechanics work in practiced silence, their tools clicking softly against aluminum in a rhythm as familiar as temple bells. Tanimizu has flown 73 combat sorties from this airfield carved into the jungle. He has painted for victory marks on his fuselage. He has written his will 3 times and torn it up twice. This morning, intelligence officers have briefed his squadron on a new American fighter, something called the Corsair. They showed grainy reconnaissance photographs of an aircraft with wings bent like the arms of a gull in flight. Grotesque and unnatural. The pilots laughed. One called it Kagami Torai, the broken bird. Another said the Americans had clearly run out of competent engineers. Tanimizu did not laugh, but neither did he worrying. He had faced wildcats over the Coral Sea and hellcats over Bougainville. He had survived by trusting the Zero's legendary maneuverability, its ability to turn inside any American fighter and bring its guns to bear. The bent-wing airplane in the photographs looked heavy, awkward, like something designed by men who had forgotten that air combat is ballet, not brawling. He climbs into his cockpit as the sun breaks amber over the volcanic peaks. Within the hour, he will understand that the Americans have not forgotten anything. They have simply decided to rewrite the rules. For 3 years, the mythology of Japanese naval aviation had rested on a foundation of undeniable truth. The Zero was not merely good, it was transcendent. When it first appeared over China in 1940, it could outclimb, outmaneuver, and outrange anything in the sky. Its combat radius of nearly 1,200 miles was unmatched. Its rate of climb was astonishing. In the hands of Japan's superbly trained carrier pilots, men who had spent years perfecting their craft, the Zero became legend. At Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, across the Dutch East Indies, and throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, Japanese pilots flew with a confidence that bordered on spiritual certainty. They had been taught that victory was a matter of spirit, of Seishin, and their aircraft seemed to embody that teaching. American pilots in the early months of the Pacific War learned brutal lessons. The Brewster Buffalo was slaughtered. The P-40 Warhawk was outclassed. Even the Grumman F4F Wildcat, sturdy and reliable, could only survive by refusing to fight the Zero on its own terms, slashing attacks from altitude, never turning, never trying to dogfight. The Americans developed tactics called thatch weave, elaborate defensive maneuvers meant simply to avoid being destroyed. By late 1942, the tide had begun to shift with the introduction of the F-6F Hellcat, but the Japanese pilot corps still held the advantage of experience, of institutional knowledge earned in blood over China and refined over the Pacific. Then came the Corsair. The chance Vought F4U Corsair did not look like a fighter plane. It looked like an accident of engineering, a compromise between competing impossibilities. The inverted gull-wing, the distinctive bent shape that caused Japanese pilots to mock it, was not a design flourish. It was a solution to a problem that would have defeated lesser engineers. The United States Navy wanted an aircraft built around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney A2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial that produced 2,000 horsepower. But that enormous engine had an enormous propeller to convert its power into thruster propeller over 13 feet in diameter. A conventional straight wing would have forced the landing gear to be impossibly tall, making carrier operations suicidal. The inverted gull-wing solved everything at once. The wing's bend allowed the landing gear to be shorter, while keeping the massive propeller clear of the deck. It reduced drag at the wing fuselage junction. It gave the pilot better visibility, but to Japanese pilots seeing it for the first time in reconnaissance photos, it simply looked wrong, as if the Americans had prioritized brute force over elegance, raw power over finesse. They were not entirely mistaken. What they failed to understand was that American engineering philosophy had undergone a fundamental transformation. The United States was no longer trying to build an aircraft that could outmaneuver the Zero. They were building an aircraft that made maneuverability irrelevant. The Corsair could fly at over 400 miles per hour in level flight, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Zero. It could dive at speeds that would tear a Zero's wings off. It could climb 3,000 feet per minute, ascending like an express elevator while Japanese fighters struggled below. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition and could saw a Zero in half in a 2-second burst. The Americans had looked at the fundamental mathematics of aerial combat and decided that energy, speed, and altitude mattered more than agility. A Corsair pilot who maintained his speed advantage never needed to turn with a Zero. He could dive from above, fire, and climb back to altitude before the Zero could react, using the Corsair's superior power to dictate every engagement. The Japanese called this tactic Iteki Rishin, one strike, certain kill, and they had no answer for it. But in January of 1944, most Japanese pilots had only heard rumors of the Corsair. They had not yet felt its presence, like a hammer falling from heaven. Warrant Officer Tanimizu sees them first as dark spakes above Rabaul's volcanic clouds, silhouetted against the cobalt morning sky. His flight of 8 Zeros is on patrol, weaving lazily at 18,000 feet. The Americans are higher, always higher now. He thinks with irritation perhaps, at 25,000 feet. He counts 12 aircraft, their wings catching the sun in strange angular flashes. The bent wings. His pulse quickens, but his hands remain steady on the stick. He clicks his radio twice, the signal for enemy contact, and pulls his Zero into a climbing turn, trading speed for altitude. The other 7 Zeros follow in practiced formation. They have done this 1,000 times. They know the Americans will dive, and when they do, the Zeros will turn inside them, and then it becomes a knife fight where maneuverability wins. Tanimizu watches the American formation break and dive, and even at this distance, he perceives that something is different. They are not diving desperately, not throwing themselves downward in the barely controlled fall of a wildcat trying to escape. They are diving with purpose, with acceleration that seems to defy gravity itself. The sound reaches him before the shapes fully resolve, a sound like tearing canvas, like thunder compressed into a scream. The Corsairs fall through 20,000 feet doing over 500 miles per hour. What happens next takes less than 30 seconds. But Tanimizu will remember it in fragmented slow motion for the rest of his life. The lead Corsair opens fire at a range that seems impossible. 800 yards, perhaps more. The tracers are not the thin red threads he expects, but thick golden ropes of light. And he realizes each round is enormous, .50 caliber bullets the size of a man's finger. The Zero to his left simply comes apart. One moment it is there, intact. The next, it is tumbling pieces of aluminum and burning fuel. The Corsair that killed it does not slow down. It roars past the debris at over 400 miles per hour, already pulling up in a climb so steep that Tanimizu's mind cannot reconcile it with the laws of physics he has been taught. He throws his Zero into a hard left turn, the aircraft responding instantly, the world tilting through 90 degrees. He looks for the Corsair, expecting to see it struggling to climb, vulnerable, but it is already gone, already 2,000 feet above him, climbing faster than his Zero can possibly follow. Another Corsair dives through their formation. Another Zero explodes. Tanimizu tries to climb after them, pushing his throttle to the gate, but his Zero climbs like a leaf rising on a thermal, while the Corsairs ascend like missiles. A third Zero falls, spinning with smoke trailing from its engine. Then a fourth. The Americans do not dogfight. They do not circle and feint and probe for advantage. They simply dive, kill, and climb away, using speed and altitude like a fortress the Zeros cannot breach. Tanimizu's engine is screaming now, the entire aircraft shaking with the strain of maximum throttle, but he is still 1,500 feet below the lowest Corsair. He watches as they reform at 30,000 feet, impossibly high, impossibly fast, and then dive again. By the time the engagement ends, 6 of the 8 Zeros are gone. Tanimizu and one other pilot survive only because they dive away, trading altitude for speed, running for cloud cover, with the Corsairs pursuing until someone calls them off. Tanimizu lands at Rabaul, with his hands shaking so badly that he nearly crashes on the runway. He climbs out of his cockpit, leans against the fuselage, and vomits onto the coral. His squadron leader finds him there and asks what happened. Tanimizu tries to explain, but the words sound insane even to his own ears. They were faster, he says finally. Everything we did, they were faster. The squadron leader nods slowly. He has received similar reports from other airfields, from Truk, from the Marianas. The Corsair is appearing everywhere, and everywhere it appears, Zeros fall from the sky in numbers that seem apocalyptic. The Japanese Naval Air Force is beginning to understand that they are no longer fighting an enemy who fears them. They are fighting an enemy who has surpassed them so completely that fear itself has become obsolete. The genius of the Corsair lay not in any single innovation, but in the totality of American industrial and engineering philosophy made manifest in aluminum and steel. While Japanese aircraft designers worked within severe constraints, limited aluminum, limited fuel, limited manufacturing capacity, American designers worked with abundance as their starting assumption. The Corsair weighed over 9,000 pounds empty, nearly double the Zero's weight. To Japanese engineers, this seemed like madness, an unforgivable waste of resources. To American engineers, it was simply the cost of building an aircraft that would dominate every aspect of the air combat envelope except turning radius, and then developing tactics that made turning radius irrelevant. The R2800 engine that powered the Corsair was itself a miracle of abundance. It was over-engineered, built with tolerances and redundancies that seemed excessive, capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy a Japanese engine. Corsairs returned from combat with cylinders shot away, cooling fins shattered, oil lines severed, and still kept flying. Zeros with similar damage simply fell. The Corsair's armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks features Japanese aircraft largely lacked meant that American pilots could survive hits that would have killed their Japanese counterparts. This was abundance translated into survival rates, into pilots who flew 50 missions instead of dying on their 5th. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound and corrosive. They had been taught that Seishin would overcome material disadvantage, that fighting spirit mattered more than horsepower or armor plate. The Corsair made a mockery of that teaching. No amount of courage could allow a Zero to climb faster than physics permitted. No depth of spiritual dedication could make bullets fired from a 20mm cannon equal the destructive power of 6.50 caliber machine guns. Japanese pilots began to report that engaging Corsairs was suicide, that the only rational response was to avoid combat entirely. This was heresy in an air force that had built its identity on aggressive attack, on never refusing battle. But doctrine written in 1941 could not change the reality of 1944. By mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation was collapsing. The superbly trained pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor were dead, replaced by hastily trained teenagers with perhaps 50 hours of flight time. These boys were sent up in Zeros against American pilots in Corsairs, and they died in numbers that became statistical abstractions. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. American losses were minimal. Corsairs accounted for a significant portion of those kills, their pilots diving again and again into formations of Japanese aircraft, firing with the clinical efficiency of men who knew they held every advantage. There is a letter preserved in the archives of the Imperial Japanese Navy. written by a flight instructor at the Suzuka Air Base in late 1944. His name was Lieutenant Saburo Sokai, and he was one of Japan's great surviving aces, credited with over 60 kills. He wrote to a friend, describing the new reality his students faced: "I send them up in zeros and tell them to fight with courage and honor. But I know I am sending them to their deaths." The American pilots fly aircraft that are faster, more powerful, better armed, better protected. Our students are brave, but bravery cannot overcome a 200-mile-per-hour speed disadvantage. When I see a Corsair, I feel something I never felt in China, something I never felt in the early months of the Pacific War. I feel obsolete. This was the true revolution the Corsair represented. Not merely a tactical or technical advantage, but a philosophical demolition of Japanese air combat doctrine. The Zero had been designed around the concept of the decisive dogfight, the turning battle where superior maneuverability and pilot skill would prevail. The Corsair simply refused to fight that battle. It fought a different war entirely, one where altitude was sanctuary and speed was armor, and engagement was always optional for the Corsair pilot and never optional for his opponent. The bent wings that Japanese pilots had mocked became a symbol of something larger, something they had not anticipated. Those wings represented a kind of engineering confidence that came from working without constraint, from being able to say, "We need to solve this problem," and having the resources to solve it completely rather than compromising. The inverted Gull-Wing was not an elegant solution in the aesthetic sense, it was an elegant solution in the engineering sense, perfectly optimized for its purpose. And that purpose was to take the most powerful engine in the world and translate its power into absolute dominance. By late 1944, the Corsair's reputation had spread throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese pilots called it Shino Kumar, the Death Bear, or Yumishiazora, the Blue Demon. Some pilots claimed to see Corsairs in their dreams. Radio intercepts of Japanese communications revealed a consistent pattern. When Corsairs were spotted, Japanese formations would break off attacks, even when they outnumbered the Americans. The psychological warfare was unintentional but devastating. The Corsair had become not just a weapon, but a presence, a manifestation of American material superiority so complete that it induced paralysis. Warrant Officer Tanimizu survived the war, one of the very few Japanese naval aviators to do so. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, he spoke carefully about his experiences, measuring his words with the precision of a man who has spent decades thinking about what happened and why. He spoke about the Zero with something like love, its responsiveness, its grace, the way it made him feel like he was wearing the aircraft rather than flying it. He spoke about the Corsair differently. The Corsair was not graceful, he said. It was brutal. When you saw one, you knew you were facing something that did not care about tradition or honor or fighting spirit. It cared only about killing you. And it had been designed by men who understood exactly how to do that. The bent wings, we laughed at those wings, you understand. We thought they were proof that the Americans did not know how to build fighters. But those wings were proof of something else. They were proof that the Americans could afford to solve problems we could not even acknowledge. They could afford to add weight for armor. They could afford to add weight for bigger guns. They could afford to bend the wing to accommodate a propeller we could never have manufactured. That was what we were really fighting, not bad pilots in strange airplanes, but the accumulated wealth of a continent turned toward the purpose of our destruction. The statistics tell part of the story. Between February 1943 and the end of the war, Corsairs were credited with 2,140 air-to-air kills against enemy aircraft. Their loss rate was 0.45 to 1 for every Corsair lost in air combat. American pilots shot down more than 11 Japanese aircraft, but statistics cannot capture the experiential reality, the visceral shock that Japanese pilots felt when they first encountered an aircraft that could simply dictate the terms of engagement. In traditional naval air combat, there had always been an element of chess-like mutual decision-making. Both sides could choose to engage or disengage based on tactical assessment. The Corsair eliminated that mutuality. A Corsair pilot at altitude with a speed advantage could always choose to engage. A Zero pilot, once spotted, could almost never choose to disengage because he lacked the speed to escape. This asymmetry was paralyzing. It transformed air combat from a contest of skill into something closer to execution. The bent wings became a harbinger of that execution, a symbol easily recognized even at distance, generating a Pavlovian spike of adrenaline and fear. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Corsair was what it revealed about competing philosophies of technology and warfare. The Zero represented a kind of mechanical poetry, light, elegant, designed to amplify the skill of an expert pilot. It was an aircraft built by a nation that valued craftsmanship and individual excellence, that believed in quality over quantity. The Corsair represented something different: brute force engineering, overwhelming an opponent through sheer material advantage. It was an aircraft built by a nation that could afford to put 2,000 horsepower engines and 6 heavy machine guns and armor plate in every fighter, that could train pilots in simulators and feed them 3,000 calories a day and rotate them home if they accumulated too much stress. The Zero asked its pilot to be a samurai. The Corsair asked its pilot merely to be competent, because the aircraft itself provided the margin of superiority. This was not a moral judgment. Both approaches were valid attempts to solve the problem of air superiority. But in total war, abundance defeats elegance. Mass defeats refinement. The Americans could afford to lose 100 Corsairs and build 150 to replace them. The Japanese could not afford to lose even one experienced pilot, and by 1944, they were losing dozens every day. There is a particular melancholy in reading Japanese pilot diaries from the last year of the war. They speak of cherry blossoms and duty and acceptance of death, but underneath the formality, there is an undercurrent of bewilderment. These men had been told they were the elite, that their training and spirit would overcome any obstacle. Then they climbed into worn-out Zeros and faced 18-year-old American pilots in brand-new Corsairs, and they discovered that the universe was not organized according to the principles they had been taught. One pilot, whose diary was recovered after his death at Okinawa, wrote, "We are told to fight with the spirit of the cherry blossom, beautiful and brief. But the Americans do not fight with spirit. They fight with engines and steel and endless waves of aircraft. How do you fight an enemy who treats war as a problem of production rather than a test of honor? How do you defeat abundance itself?" These were the questions the Corsair forced Japanese pilots to confront, and there were no good answers. The end, when it came, was not a single climactic moment, but a slow dissolution. By 1945, Japanese naval aviation had been reduced to kamikaze attacks, young pilots with minimal training flying obsolete aircraft on one-way missions. Even here, the Corsair proved dominant. Its speed and firepower made it superbly effective at intercepting suicide attackers before they could reach the fleet. Combat action reports from the Okinawa campaign are filled with terse entries: splashed Tuvals, splashed one Zeke, splashed one Oscar. The bent wing fighter that pilots had laughed at in January 1944 was, by April 1945, the most effective air defense weapon in the Pacific. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, production of the Corsair continued. The design would remain in service through the Korean War and beyond, racking up additional victories against MiG-15s, proving that its fundamental engineering philosophy, speed, power, armor, firepower, remained valid even in the jet age. The last Corsair was not retired until 1965, over 20 years after Japanese pilots first saw those bent wings and laughed. What remains now is memory and metal. A few dozen Corsairs survive in museums and private collections, their bent wings still instantly recognizable. Some still fly at air shows. The distinctive bark of the R2800 engine turning heads, triggering memories in veterans who heard that sound over beaches and jungles and carrier decks. For Japanese veterans like Tanemizu, the sound carried different associations: the scream of a dive attack, the chatter of those 6 machine guns, the sudden silence when a wingman's radio went dead. The Corsair was not the most produced American fighter of World War II. That honor went to the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was not the most graceful. Many consider the P-51 Mustang more aesthetically pleasing, but it was, in many ways, the most psychologically devastating. It represented the moment when Japanese pilots had to confront the fact that they were not fighting an inferior enemy who needed to be taught respect for Japanese martial prowess. They were fighting an enemy who had learned from early defeats, adapted with terrifying speed, and built weapons systems so superior that skill and courage became secondary factors. The bent wings were a physical manifestation of that superiority, not because they were beautiful, but because they were the solution to a problem that Japanese engineers, working with scarce resources, could never have solved the same way. In the end, the Pacific War was decided by many factors: code breaking, logistics, submarine warfare, the atomic bomb. But in the air, it was decided in part by the accumulated weight of thousands of encounters between Japanese pilots in Zeros and American pilots in Corsairs, Hellcats, and Lightnings. And in those encounters, the Corsair stood out for the sheer psychological shock it delivered. Pilots who had dominated the sky for 3 years found themselves suddenly, utterly outclassed. The laughter died in their throats as they watched their wingman fall and discovered that no amount of skill could overcome an opponent who flew faster, climbed higher, hit harder, and could always choose whether to fight or disengage. This was the lesson of the bent wings, that sometimes elegance loses to brute force, refinement loses to abundance, and an aircraft that looks ungainly can nevertheless rewrite the rules of aerial combat so completely that the old rules become irrelevant. The Corsair did not just defeat the Zero, it rendered the entire philosophy that produced the Zero obsolete, and in doing so, it broke not just aircraft, but the certainties of the men who flew them 50 years after the war ended. An interviewer asked Tanemizu if he ever dreamed about combat. He was silent for a long moment, looking at something beyond the camera. Then he said, "I dream about turns. In the dream, I am in my Zero, turning as tight as I can, and the American in his Corsair is above me, always above me, and I turn and turn, but I can never bring my guns to bear, and then I wake up. The bent wings, I see them sometimes in the dream, catching the sun. We thought they were funny. We thought they were proof that we were better, but they were proof of something else entirely. They were proof that the Americans could afford to be unconventional, to solve problems in ways we never imagined, because they had the resources to try things we could only dream about." That was what those wings really meant. Not bad engineering, but infinite possibility. And you cannot defeat possibility. You can only surrender to it. This is what remains, the memory of men who flew machines designed to kill each other, and in that killing, learn truths about power and technology and the terrible mathematics of industrial warfare. The Corsair is a museum piece now, a relic of a war 3 generations past, but it endures in memory as more than just an aircraft. It endures as the moment when one group of pilots realized that courage and skill, however great, could not overcome an enemy who had married engineering brilliance to industrial abundance. The bent wings that drew laughter became the shape of that realization, carried across the Pacific skies on pillars of thunder, until laughter turned to silence and silence turned to surrender, and the long war finally ended.